Hey guys, welcome back. We'll continue with the book Automate the Boring Stuff with Python. And in this video, we're going to focus on input validation. You can read the book and follow along for free by heading over to automatetheboringstuff.com. And there you're going to find this chapter. It's also linked in the description down below. And if you prefer a physical copy of the book, there's a link to the description down below as well. So let's jump right in. Input validation is always used to check if certain values that have been entered by a user, such as text for example from the input function, are formatted correctly. So for example, if we want to check if a user provides some numbers as input, we want to check that the user didn't type, for example, some text or some other input that is not a number. And to accomplish something like that, we can go ahead and we can write a short function that validates our input. Let's head over to our code editor and let's have a look. And here we have a short program that basically checks whether a user provided a valid age. So here we have a while loop that's set to be true. So we keep on looping until we encounter a break condition. So here we are asking the user to enter the age. We're using the input function to get that age, and then we have a try except block where we are checking if we can convert the input the user provided into an integer. If that's possible, we are going to assign that to the age variable. If not, we are going to print out an error message telling the user to provide some numeric input. And then we use the continue clause here to skip the rest of the loop and start back at the beginning of the while loop. And then after that, we check if the age is less than 1. In that case, we ask the user to provide a positive number. And if all of these conditions are met, then we break out of the statement. And then at the end, we are printing out what the age is. So let's run our code here and let's have a look at that. So if we type in our age as a text rather than a number, we of course get this error message here that we shouldn't use numeric digits, and we are asked to provide our age again. If we type in a negative number, then we are notified that we should enter a positive number. And then if we enter a valid input, of course our age will be printed out. Now this is one way of how we can use input validation to check whether the provided input is valid. But of course it would be quite a lot of work to always have to cover all these cases when we handle some user input. And to facilitate that input validation, we can use an already existing module in Python, which is a PyInputPlus module. And that module already covers a lot of standard cases that we typically want to work with. So let's have a closer look at how we can use that module. Now, since PyInputPlus is not part of the default Python library, we need to install it separately. Now, if you're using the Mu editor, that's really straightforward. All you need to do is to click on that gear icon on the bottom right side. And here we can head over to third-party packages and just type in PyInputPlus, press OK, and it's going to install that module. If you're using a different code editor, you can head over and open your terminal, and then you can type in pip install --user and then PyInputPlus, and that's going to install it as well. Either option is going to work. Let's have a quick look at some of the functions that PyInputPlus provides. So we can basically check different kinds of input and see if it's valid. So here, for example, we have a function called inputString, and this is like the built-in input function that we worked with before, but it also includes some additional validations that PyInputPlus provides. So it's going to check that the inputted value is indeed a string. And we have the same for numbers here, for example, so we can check whether the provided input returns an int or a float. And if it does not, then we're going to get appropriate error messages back notifying the user that they should enter a valid input. Now with these basics covered, let's actually try this out. We can go ahead and we can import PyInputPlus. And since this is quite a long name, to make it a little bit easier to later on call the functions, let's use the s alias to import that under a different name. So we are abbreviating it here to PyIP. Let's confirm this. And now we can use the function we just looked at before. So here we are calling input num on PyIP, and we are assigning that to the variable response. And now this is going to expect some input from us, of course, because that function is being called this input num function, which is quite similar to the input function that Python provides out of the box. But let's go ahead and let's type in some invalid input. So here, of course, we are expecting some number. Instead, we are typing in a word, a string. and then we automatically get back that the input we provided is not a number. If instead we provide a valid input, 42 for example, that is accepted and it's assigned to the response variable. So if we have a look at that, we can see indeed response is set to 42. Now that worked properly, but it might be a little bit unclear for the user what they should actually provide if we use it as part of a program. So here when we call input num, we just had basically an empty cursor where we expected some input, but the user didn't really know what to input. And before we handled that by actually passing some text to the input function to clearly print out what the user should provide. And we can do the same with our PyInputPlus module. We pass the optional prompt keyword argument to our input num function, and then we provide the text that should be printed out to the user. So here we are asking the user to enter a number. And so this is being printed out and we can then get some input from a user. And of course the validation still works properly. So only when a number is entered will it actually be accepted and then assigned to the variable. Now we can pass some additional keyword arguments to the functions we looked at. So for example, input num, as well as input int or input float, except for example a greater than or less than keyword argument. So we want to ensure that the input is in a certain range. We can pass that as an optional argument. So here we are calling input num and we are providing some text, and then we're passing an optional keyword argument to it. So here minimum, which is set to 4. So as we call this, we get back enter num. We can type in a value, and if we type in a value that's less than the minimum, for example 3, then we get back that the number must be at a minimum 4. And if we type in 4 or a larger value, then of course that's properly saved and it's stored in our response variable. If you want to ensure that the value is larger than a certain value, we can use greater than instead and set that equal to the value. And now the input needs to be larger than the value. So if we type in anything less than 3, we're gonna get the message back that the number must be greater. But the same is true also if we type in 4. While the min keyword argument is inclusive of the number, greater than really requires a number that's larger than the provided value here. We can also use less than to ensure that the input is less than the provided argument here. And we can even combine multiple keyword arguments. So here we are saying that we have a minimum of 4, but that the value has to be less than 6. So if we type in a value such as 6 or higher, we get back the output that the number must be less than that value. And if we type in a value that's less than 4, then of course we also get back the message that it must be at least 4. So if we type in something like 5, that's going to be accepted and of course stored in our response variable. Now by default, when we work with any of those functions inside of the PyInputPlus module, we are not able to enter any blank values. So as I just press enter here, I get back the message that blank values are not allowed. So I always need to provide a value. There might be some cases where we want to make sure that blank values can be provided. And for that we have to use the keyword argument blank and set that to true. Now we can go ahead and we can just press enter and that's going to be properly stored. So if we have a look at the value of response, we get back an empty string. Now by default, the PyInputPlus functions will continue to ask the user for valid input forever. So as long as the program runs and as long as the user did not provide some valid input. But if we don't want that, if we want to limit the number of times we ask a user based either on the number of tries the user has already taken or based on the time, we can do that. And there are the limit and timeout keyword arguments that we can use for that. So let's have a look at that. And here we can see we are using the input num function and we pass the keyword argument of limit to it and we limit the number of times the user is being asked to 2 times. So of course we are expecting some number as an input, but if we go ahead and we type in some string, we get of course back that this is not a number. And if we type a string again, we get back that again this is not a number, and then we get back a retry limit exception that tells us that all the allowed tries have been exhausted. And something like that can be useful if we want to limit the number of tries. For example, when a user is asked to provide a password and we want to ensure that the user only has a limited number of tries. Rather than limiting the number of tries, we can also use a keyword argument timeout. And this is going to be time-based in seconds. So here I'm going to call this input here. And now the user has basically 5 seconds to enter the input. If we wait longer than that, and then we provide a valid input 42, and we press enter, we're gonna get a timeout exception. So this is ensuring that we enter the input within a certain time frame. Now, rather than having such an error message, such an exception that's being shown, we can also provide a default value, and that avoids that we get this error message. Instead, the default value will then be returned, and in our case, be assigned to the response variable. So let's have another look at that. And here we are using the limit keyword argument again, and also the default keyword argument with the input num function. So if we enter an invalid input and another invalid input, then our execution here will stop because we limited it to 2 tries. But rather than getting an exception, it just stops and it's going to assign the default value here to the response variable. So as we take a look at that, we get back the string NA. That's exactly not available. That's exactly what we set as the default value here. We can also use regular expressions to specify whether an input is allowed or not. And for that we have 2 separate keyword arguments: allow regex and block regex. And based on that we can decide if we want to include or exclude whatever is specified as a regex. So here we are using input num as before, and then we are using that keyword argument to allow the following regular expressions on top of course, what is already allowed in terms of input num. And here we pass in Roman numerals as well as the string 0. So as we go ahead, of course, we could just type in regular numbers. That would be accepted. But we can also go ahead and, for example, type in 0 as well as any Roman numerals. So for example, something like this. If instead we want to restrict what can be entered as a value, we can use block regexes instead as the keyword argument to input num. And now if we go ahead and we type in a number like 42, which includes values that are specified to be excluded, we're gonna get back that this input is invalid. And then only as we provide a value that is not excluded is that gonna be accepted and stored back in our variable. We can also use both of the keyword arguments we just learned about to allow regular expressions and to block certain regular expressions. In such a case, if they are sort of in conflict with each other, then the allow regex keyword argument is going to win out and is going to override the block list. So here, for example, we have caterpillar and category as allowed regexes, and then we are blocking cat, which of course is a substring of both caterpillar and category. So if we type in cat, that indeed will be blocked. But if we now go ahead and we type out category, for example, which is one of the allowed values, even though it has cat in it as a substring, that is going to be accepted and will be assigned to the variable. We can also use custom validation functions to perform our own custom validation logic. And for that we can use the input custom function. So here we have our own custom function that's called adds up to 10. We're going to accept some input, and then we want to ensure that whatever is provided adds up to 10. So for that we are taking that input that has been provided, which is a string, and we're calling list on it, which is going to take that input, for example a number such as 1, 2, 3, and is going to split up each entry. So we are going to have an entry 1, an entry 2, an entry 3, and that's going to be stored in our numbers list. And then we are looping over our entries here, and we're turning all of the entries inside of our list into an integer and storing that back in the numbers list. And if the sum of the values in the numbers list is not equal to 10, we are going to raise an exception, telling the user that the numbers must add to 10. And if they add up to 10, then we are returning those values. So to actually call that function, we are calling input custom on our module here, PyInputPlus, and we are passing the function to it, so adds up to 10. And that's going to be stored back in response. So let's run our program. And if we type in an input such as 1, 2, 3, which of course does not add up to 10 because 3 plus 2 plus 1 is 6, not 10, we get back that the numbers need to add up to 10. And also if we go above 10, so in this case here we are typing in 1, 2, 3, 5, which adds up to 11. That's also invalid, but if we type, for example, in 1, 2, 3, 4, which adds up to 10, then that's stored properly, that's inside of our response variable. And if we run our program again and we type in some invalid input, so for example the string hello, we get back that this is an invalid literal for an integer with base 10. So we still get the default validation from the PyInputs module. And writing our own custom validation functions is very useful when it's otherwise difficult or impossible to write a regular expression for the valid input, as for example in our adds up to 10 example case. Let's take a look at a couple of projects that we can implement using PyInputPlus and input validation. The first project is going to be how to keep an idiot busy for hours, and we're going to use the PyInputPlus module to create a simple program that's going to ask the user if they'd like to know how to keep an idiot busy for hours, and then if the user answers no, we're going to quit the program, and otherwise we're basically going to keep the user in that loop and print that out. So that's fairly simple to implement using PyInputPlus. So first of all, we need to import PyInputPlus, and we are aliasing this as PyIP. Then we have a while loop that's set to keep on looping until we have a break statement. We have a prompt variable with some string asking the user if they want to know how to keep an idiot busy for hours. We pass that as an input to the input yes no function, which is a default function in PyInputPlus that just accepts yes and no as the input. And then if the response is no, we're going to break out of the loop, otherwise we're going to keep on looping. And outside of that, we're going to print out thank you, have a nice day. So as we run our program, we're going to get the question, want to know how to keep an idiot busy for hours. So we type in sure, for example, and then we automatically get back that sure is not a valid yes no response. So again, we are asked, want to know how to keep an idiot busy for hours. And if we type in yes, we're just going to stay in the loop. This is also case insensitive. So even if we capitalize this is going to work properly. And of course, if we add any other characters, for example, exclamation marks, it's going to tell us that this is not a valid input. And this is going to keep on looping until, of course, at the end we type in no, and then we broke out. We showed that we're not an idiot, and it says thank you, have a nice day. So this is just one example of how we can utilize the default functions provided by PyInputPlus to save us a lot of work figuring out the validation. But PyInputPlus can also be used for other cases. Here, for example, we have a multiplication quiz that we are working with, and especially if we use those keyword arguments we learned about before, such as to allow or block regular expressions, the timeout argument or the limit argument, we can use that to create a multiplication quiz. Of course, we need to make sure that we import PyInputPlus, and we're also going to use the random module and the time module. And we're going to have a quiz of 10 questions. We're going to keep track of the number of correct answers the user provided, and basically we ask the user to multiply two numbers together. Those numbers should be generated randomly between 0 and 9. So we store that in a variable num1 and num2. And we have a for loop here that's looping over the range of the number of questions. So here we set that to 10, so we're going to basically provide 10 questions that should be answered. We have a prompt here that's asking the user to provide the answer to multiplying two numbers together, and we are also providing the question number. And after that, we are using the input string function provided by PyInputPlus. We're passing the prompt to it, so asking what the multiplication equals to, and then we allow certain regular expressions. In this case, we are using a regular expression to make sure that the input that the user enters starts and ends with the number provided, and since we are using %s, that's going to evaluate to what is the valid result of multiplying num1 and num2 together. And then we are also using block regexes here to basically block any other input. So we are using the dot operator and then the star operator to basically match any other input. In this case, we are going to set this to a default value of incorrect, and that's going to be printed out to the user. And also we want to give some time restrictions, so we have a timeout value here set to 8, so the user has 8 seconds to answer each question, and we have a limit of 3, so the user has a maximum of 3 tries to get the answer correct. And we are wrapping this inside of a try block, and then we have 2 except statements here. One is to cover the timeout exception case. In this case we are going to print out of time, and if the limit has been reached of 3, then we are going to print out of tries. In all other cases, we are going to print out correct to signal that the answer was indeed correct, and we are going to increment correct answers by 1, and then we are going to have a very small pause of just 1 second, and we are going to print out the score. So in this case, we are taking the number of correct answers and the number of questions to show the score at the end of those 10 questions. So let's run our program. And here 0 times 6 of course is 0, so we are printing out correct. 5 times 5 is 25. Now let's get something incorrect. 9 times 2, let's just say we type in 17, which is incorrect. We have another try. Let's type in 19, so that's incorrect and we are also out of time. 4 times 1, we're also out of time, but let's answer the other questions correctly. And here at the end we get our score, so we answered 8 out of 10 questions correctly. So that's an example of how we can use PyInputPlus to cover a lot of the edge cases in our quiz here, and that of course facilitates the input validation, and especially if we use that with regular expressions, we really save a lot of code that we would otherwise have to write. Now let's have a look at the practice questions. The first one is if PyInputPlus comes with a Python standard library. And that's not the case. We always need to ensure that we install PyInputPlus and then import it in order to use it. Why is PyInputPlus commonly imported with import PyInputPlus as PyIP? So why are you be using that as alias? And the reason is that it's just a lot shorter to type out PyIP when we call a function on it, rather than always having to type out PyInputPlus. What is the difference between input_int and input_float? So these are two functions included in PyInputPlus, and input_int is going to check whether the input entered is an integer number, while input_float is going to check whether it's a float number, so a number with a decimal point. How can we ensure that the user enters a whole number between 0 and 99 using PyInputPlus? So first of all, we would import PyInputPlus, and then we call PyIP, which is our alias for PyInputPlus, with the input_int function, and we pass in two keyword arguments. The first one is min with a value of 0, and the second one is max with a value of 99. And so if we try to enter a value less than 0, we're going to get back that the number must be at a minimum 100, and if we type in a number larger than 99, we're going to get back that the number must be at a maximum 99, so it has to be inside of that range. What is passed to the allow regexes and block regexes keyword arguments? So we're going to pass in the regular expressions that should either be allowed in addition to what the PyInputPlus function already allows. So we saw that example before of allowing Roman decimal numbers in addition to regular integer numbers, and then block regexes would specify which input is not allowed, even if it's provided as part of the PyInputPlus method. So we saw that example before that we excluded certain integer values so that they could not be entered. For example, the number 2 or 4 could not be entered, even though the PyInputPlus method that we used would generally allow that. What does input string limit 3 do if blank input is entered 3 times? So if we use that function and we enter blank input 3 times, which is not allowed, then we're gonna get an error. So here if we take PyInputPlus and we call input string on it with a limit of 3, if we enter blank values are not allowed, we do that 3 times, we're gonna get the retry limit exception because we exhausted all the tries that we had available. And finally, what does input string limit 3 default hello do if blank input is entered 3 times? So in this case here we still have the limit of 3 times the input, and blank input is still not allowed, but we have a default value, so if we exhaust those limits, then we're gonna get back hello as a return value. So if we have a look at that, and we call input string with a limit of 3 and a default of hello, and we type in enter, blank values are not allowed, we get that, and on the third try here, we get back the value hello, because that's now the new default return value that's used, so we avoid that exception as we saw before, but instead we get back the default value. And that can be a better way to handle those cases where an invalid value is provided and we don't want to run into an exception. We learned about input validation and specifically about the PyInputPlus module and how we can use it to validate input. We also learned how we can pass keyword arguments to it, for example, to handle regular expressions. In the next video, we're going to learn how we can read and write files using Python. Subscribe to the channel to get notified whenever a new video is being released, and see you guys in the next video.